Benchmark, the voice of business. Presented by LMD.
On this edition of Benchmark, in the hot seat today is Kasturi Chellaraja Wilson, the Managing Director of Hemas Pharmaceuticals, to discuss a range of issues pertaining to the pharmaceutical industry. The LMD Nielsen Business Confidence Index shed 21 basis points in February. More on this from Nielsen's Director of Consumer Insights, Therika Miyanadenia. And in our final segment, LMD's columnist Shiran Fernando focuses on Sri Lanka's macro outlook, in particular the spread of the coronavirus and its impact on the economy. That's the lineup for Benchmark.
Hello and welcome to the Big Picture Business Program Benchmark. I'm Savitri Rodrigo. International Women's Day is celebrated in March each year. And celebrating that, we have with us today in the hot seat the first female president of the Sri Lanka Chamber of Pharmaceutical Industry and who is also the Managing Director of Hemas Pharmaceuticals, Kasturi Chellaraja Wilson. And we will be dealing with the pharmaceutical industry. Ahead in the program, what we will be discussing among other issues would be the reforms that are required in the industry, the measures that are needed to promote innovation and R&D, and also how do we ensure a fair price mechanism for pharmaceuticals. Kasturi, welcome to the program. Good to have you on the show. When you do look at your industry at this point of time, what exactly do you see?
So as you ask this question, actually it's kind of an important journey for Sri Lanka to kind of take a decision at this point. So from a pharmaceutical industry point of view, 80 to 85% of our requirement is imported. And we have a local manufacturing aspect which is about 15%. Then from a supplies on the channels point of view, from the consumer's point of view, you either go into the state, there's about 50% who go into the state, they go for free healthcare, and they do also have access from the state pharmaceutical corporation, which is giving generics at a very affordable price to the consumer. And then you have private health, that's where you have majority, the 3,000 pharmacies who give you access to global brands, anything, the variety you want, from the innovator to a generic. But the fact that we are an import-driven country is the biggest problem we are facing now. Whether we are more locally manufacturing or whether we are importing the finished good, we are import driven. So when you are locally manufacturing, the raw material, which is called the API, we source it from China. So the impact of COVID-D to Sri Lanka in another 3 months would see some kind of tension in terms of how we are going to fulfill requirements. It's not only isolated to us, it is a global phenomenon. India might be more kind of self-sufficient purely because they have their API plants as well. But generally from the world's perspective, for antibiotics there might be some impact. So Sri Lanka currently is at a state where you have the state procurement arm which has failed in the last 3 years in terms of over-procuring or I don't know, having no sanity in what they spend, owing the industry a huge amount of money. Hence, the supplies to the state have been curtailed. So you anyway have an inherent shortage. And then you have COVID-19 coming in, which means they have another impact. And in the backdrop of it, you know that we went into price control the last 3 years, 3.5, 4 years now. And price control kind of stabilized, but price control without a proper mechanism was kind of where we found manufacturers putting out certain drugs. So we are at an interesting point. Sri Lanka anyway has an excellent healthcare system, whether it's private or state, in terms of outcome. I guess we need to manage and understand, have a proper framework. How do you manage the supplies? How do you manage the services?
So how ready are we as a nation to tackle global outbreaks like COVID-19, which we have been seeing recently, from a doctor-patient perspective?
From a patient, I think from a country perspective, I think we have gone through so many epidemics that our healthcare system is quite geared to seeing different varieties and handling it. be it dengue, be it influenza A. And I think that we have some of the world's best doctors here. Infrastructure and the capacity to handle big epidemics, I think that's where we have a bottleneck. We have one, IVH I think has one facility. Private sector, we cannot, actually don't have that kind of numbers to isolate. But I guess Sri Lanka, knowing Sri Lanka and the healthcare system, our doctors kind of manage it and they manage to find solutions. So I don't have too much of a concern about the capability of finding a solution. My concern in the healthcare system to handle these epidemics is that we are not self-sufficient, we are reliant on global supply chain like any other world, part of the supply chain for pharmaceuticals. But moreover, for any manufacturing aspect in Sri Lanka, I think the raw materials are all imported. So I guess we are absolutely vulnerable to the global impacts.
In your view, is the current regulatory environment conducive to the industry's growth?
A regulator is there, has a main role is to make sure that any drug brought in or manufactured is of quality, right? The second aspect is that they have to make sure there is accessibility to patients, and third aspect is the affordability. What has happened is on the private market perspective, that is private market, when I say private market, I mean what's sold at a private pharmacy. There is a process of making sure the product is registered, is compliant. So Sri Lanka, for example, doesn't have a quality lab to check post-market quality. But to register in Sri Lanka, you need to have, the product should have been registered and marketed in a reference country. So what do we call reference countries like UK, US, Europe, FDA approved plants, we talk about Australia. So we talk about very evolved, developed countries who have developed labs, developed regulatory environments, and we piggyback off that. So more or less you're ensuring that there is quality when it comes in. And the responsible importers actually take this very seriously. The aspect of the state procurement, when they go into emergency supplies, and procurement, as it says, has in any, whether it's private or state, has its vulnerabilities in terms of how it can be manipulated. The quality aspect is kind of bypassed to a great extent. So that's a huge risk, I think, which has to come back into the regulator, in the sense they have to have oversight on that. But the bigger issue is for accessibility, when affordability is, so that's how the price control came in the context of affordability, which is really important from a patient's point of view. Affordability, when there is no sustainability, as in that Sri Lanka can't be the lowest in the region, purely because there are other markets, whereas suppliers have other options. So they call it pharmacoeconomics, right? It's economics. So there's demand and supply. So they would technically say Sri Lanka is not attractive, or they would supply to preference markets where they get higher revenue. So we need to balance that, but you need that mechanism. In the absence of that, patients won't have access to this in the long term, because manufacturers will pull out of Sri Lanka. So I must say, while engaging with the regulator, we've had, and the minister, we've managed to get ad hoc price adjustments when the rupee devalued. But our job shouldn't be running in for adjustments as and when the rupee devalues or appreciates. There has to be a mechanism which makes the industry move forward.
Speaking of accessibility, the State Pharmaceuticals Corporation said it intended to increase the local market supply by 60% in 2020. What reforms do you think are needed to ensure that the local industry's ability is there to meet Sri Lanka's demand and supply?
So this is, I think most countries are advocating domestic supplies. The disadvantage Sri Lanka has is that when we set up plants which are EU GMP or forget FDA approved but PICS approved, to get that plant to give you and to make it, when you produce tablets or injectables or whatever through that, and compete with India, the same price, it's tough. Remember, all our raw materials, even to construct the plant is imported, right? And then your raw materials to manufacture is imported. However, I think the state has to make sure that the quality parameters of Sri Lankan manufacturers are at global standard. Then when you pay them even a premium if they suggest, that's fine. It's going to stay back in the economy. And these plants can come into a global best practice in terms of production. It shouldn't be within the importers or manufacturers. It should be that any product coming out of it is of the quality standard which we want. Then they would be the preferred supplier for Sri Lanka, but they would also compete in the regional markets. And especially now with all the disruptions going on in global supply chain, it gives us an advantage, because look at our positioning from a logistics perspective. I think this has easy access into Africa as well as the East.
So we'll be discussing the rest of the pharmaceutical industry issues and problems, Kasturi, after the commercial break. Coming up after the break, we ask Kasturi Chellaraja Wilson her take on the procurement processes for pharmaceuticals and her assessment on the talent available in the industry. Do stay with us.
We are a Sri Lankan bank. This is our home. That's why we are committed towards the future of this country, funding national development initiatives, because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Thank you for staying with us on Benchmark. We are discussing the pharmaceutical industry with Kasturi Chellaraja Wilson, the Managing Director of Hemas Pharmaceuticals. Kasturi, if we look at the rate of innovation, the processes that go in, and the level of innovation and R&D in Sri Lanka, what more needs to be done?
So, innovation, whether it's Sri Lanka or in the region, it's at a very low level or non-existent, leaving India aside, right? And that is nothing to do, that's not a bad indicator. If you look at Bangladesh, it's focusing on being excellent in producing innovative drugs which are within patent, because they have not signed up into the agreement, patent protection agreements, which is fine. The innovation and R&D is a humongous cost, and I mean, we can't even rationalize a plant of an FDA approved plant making sense in Sri Lanka for a 20 million. We can't run away from the fact that we have a smaller population, and unless you actually advocate global innovation centers here, us manufacturers putting in research centers here alone it's not going to make sense. But what we can do is, we have to, like India did, when India went down price control and they brought manufacturing as a focus, they actually encouraged innovation by saying, if you innovate, you don't get price control for so many years. But having said that, they put control on the imports which innovators were bringing in. That was kind of slowing down. Eventually they changed policy, saying even a global manufacturer who comes with new innovation gets protection and no price control. So they have a policy which encourages global innovation to come in. And once patent lapses, they would tell them that they are upfront. This is how we bring your prices down. But they encourage the innovation to come in. So I think that's kind of a method we need to look at. That's where the pricing mechanism and framework should look at this. That we don't want innovation going out. So whatever we do, how do we address it? So innovation is only patent protected for a certain period. After that, you have a mechanism to make sure patient gets the benefit. And generally, Sri Lanka, for this small volume of people or number of people we've got, It doesn't come in as and when a new product comes into the global arena. It doesn't come necessarily to Sri Lanka in the first wave. We come in the second or third wave because they put this to more lucrative, bigger markets, and then they come into Sri Lanka. So by the time they come into Sri Lanka, they have about 4 or 5 years left in the pain, and then you kind of manage it. So I think we need that. It's not for anything else. We also, innovation, when you have global companies coming in, our doctors get exposed to the new innovative thinking because they're busy looking at patients. If our companies are not exposing it, they need to be exposed to what's happening out there, with, especially in oncology, in diabetes. Those are two rampant areas in Sri Lanka. Cardiovascular, how do you do interventions? How do you prevent more of diabetic patients? Oncology, how do you get better outcomes? You know, that's a very sad thing the whole region is looking at. So I don't think we have innovation, but I don't think we should even push for it, because it wouldn't make economic sense for a company to do that, unless like in IT companies, you have a center here which you get the best in class and you give some tax incentives for them to put their research labs here or something like that.
Given that the global pharma industry actually plows back something like 17% of their budgets into R&D, do you think it makes sense for Sri Lanka to promote R&D?
So R&D is so protected by each pharmaceutical company, and if we don't have protection laws for patency like in Bangladesh, it might not work. So in the short run, I think short haul, no. What we can focus on is making ourselves into excellent manufacturing hubs. So if you look at it from Europe those days, I think 30-40 years ago, how did China become this? They were first just basic efficient manufacturers. So the European companies set up manufacturing there. They moved from that into, and Europe had the more EQ based, the high-tech manufacturing. Now they moved into high-tech manufacturing. So there might be the base level volumes. Whether we have the labor is another question, or if now in this day and age, if automation is one, but we need to get in electronics, maybe some non-traditional manufacturing plants in here. That has to come in as anchors. If you look at Vietnam, if you look at Thailand, their portfolio basket of exports have changed. They have changed from the traditional apparel to electronics, and the agri portfolio has reduced. So that is something we need to do.
So what is your assessment of talent in the industry?
We have smart people, but the fact that we are protected, we protect our companies from tax, from global competition in terms of para-tariffs or whatever we do. Due to the protection we enjoy in most industries, the best practices are not adopted here. Because we are not forced to compete. We are forced to compete with each other. That's it. I think so. Even though we have smart set of people, the attitude of learning out from the world out there and kind of implementing things here is kind of less. The bigger companies are forced to think that because our margins are under pressure with all what we are going through. But how do we uplift this talent pool and to compete in global arenas? The younger generation who have come in from graduates who are coming from the world, or maybe from Australia, from UK, they are moldable and they come with that passion to do things differently, and we kill it as they come in. So that's where the culture is important. So it's a tough thing, and it's so tough to change because it's that we don't have that environment to bring in that. And one thing about Sri Lanka, simple change is really tough. Whether it's the government, we talk about the government. I must tell private sector is equally bad. Change in any form or shape is pushed back, and when that is a precursor for anything for us to improve. Every improvement is change for us.
What is your outlook for the pharmaceutical industry for this rest of the year?
We are going to have challenging times from a patient point of view. I think we as an industry have to work very proactively to make sure that we give them supplies. That's the short-term issue. There's going to be an impact, whether it's locally manufactured or imported. it's going to be an impact. And I think from a chamber's point of view, what we want to do is engage to make sure that we give, even though the government still owes us, we are willing to see still supply, because patients, and especially the patients, the state, are the people who can't afford. And then with that also comes with a certain level of literacy. They need to get quality drugs. So we are our mandate, and we are willing to put our hand up and say, let's support the patient. But what's more interesting is, I think we need to do is what we are raising our voice up, and I think the regulator also has understood. We need to clean up the government procurement. That has brought us into this mess we're in. Between, I think, the diagnostics and pharma companies, they owe a huge amount of billions, over, I think it's about 10 to 15 billion rupees. And this is over 2-3 years, and you don't, it doesn't make sense. So if you default like that, next procurement, somebody is going to embed the interest cost in that. You can't go procuring from another supplier, because the best suppliers have supplied you, so then you're going to compromise on quality, is it? So this cleanup has to happen, and I think it has to happen at all levels. They should bring in independent people in to see the procurement patterns, the histories of payment, and it's nothing unique only to pharmaceuticals, but I can only talk about pharmaceuticals. We need to move about corruption, purely because here it's a patient. It's not a guy, a human being who is going for a holiday. It's a person who is really sick, and we shouldn't be trying to be manipulating processes and systems to make money out of that, not making undue money or misusing that system. So I think this 1 year is going to be really interesting, and especially if we need to work on our mechanism here and the pricing framework, pricing policy. If you get those 3 things done for the year, I think at least Sri Lanka could be stable. Beyond that, you have to work at getting the manufacturers actually to a global standard.
Thank you, Kasturi. Thank you for shedding light on some of the bigger issues in the pharmaceutical industry. We've been discussing the pharmaceutical industry in Sri Lanka and also a little bit globally with Kasturi Chellaraja Wilson, the Managing Director of Hemas Pharmaceuticals and the Chairman of the Sri Lanka Chamber for Pharmaceutical Industry. Do stay with us, because on the other side we have Anusha Selvaraja with more.
LMD is making waves, airwaves. The next big thing from Sri Lanka's pioneering business journal, LMD Podcast, now online. Listen to our articles on the go at www.lmd.lk. Select, play, listen. It's that simple.
We are a Sri Lankan bank. This is our home. That's why we are committed towards the future of this country, funding national development initiatives, because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Anusha Selvaraja. Now for a closer look at the latest on the LMB Nielsen Business Confidence Index. Joining me is the Director of Consumer Insights from Nielsen, Terika Miyanadeniya. Welcome back to the show, Terika. Now the DCI has continued on its decline and recently recording double-digit decline. Now what are the sensitivities behind this?
Okay, so if you look at what is happening in the country, except for the inflation, the other macroeconomic indicators have started to improve. The GDP grew 2.7 in the third quarter of 2019, driven by growth in the service and the industry sector, though still not matching up to the levels of Q1. There was a drop in imports with a marginal increase in exports. So these are positive trends of recovery from a macroeconomic point of view. However, this is not reflected in the sentiments of both the business leaders and the citizens. With little or no new economic policies and the fear of the coronavirus gripping the nation, the BCI continued to drop and is now at 153 from last month's 174. With food inflation at an alarming 8.6%, which is an all-time high since February of 2018, the CCI has also started dropping and is now at 79.
So how do respondents view the economy both in the short and the long term?
Okay, if you look at most of the other indices, they have also started to drop. And though the percentage of business leaders saying that the country's economy will improve in the coming 12 months have increased from 62% in December to 65% in the current month, the percentage of business leaders feeling that the state of their business will improve in the next year continue to come down and is now at 56% from last month 67%. This drop is also reflected for the short-term improvements in their businesses as 47% of business leaders as opposed to 57% of business leaders last month said that their businesses will improve in the next 3 months.
What about our investment prospects then?
So the current investment climate in the country has also dropped about 11 points, with 32% of business leaders in the country saying that it's a good time to invest. I think they are all waiting in expectation of what is going to happen after the general elections. And whatever the economic policies that are going to be brought in by the government will actually ascertain how the investments will happen in the company.
Now, Tarika, we are going into trying times, but what would be your projection for the BCI?
So the situation, I would say, is more or less very unpredictable. We have the general elections coming up, but the sentiments have not improved in expectation. What happens in the past is whenever there's an election or the budget, the sentiments go up in expectation of what is going to happen. But I believe both the BCI and the CCI will continue to drop. And the future of the indices will actually depend on the policies that will be brought about by the government after the general election.
Thank you very much for joining us, Tarika.
Thank you.
That was Director of Consumer Insights from Nielsen, Tarika Mianadenia. We'll be right back after a short commercial break. Stay tuned.
We are a Sri Lankan bank. This is our home. That's why we are committed towards the future of this country, funding national development initiatives, because we believe in banking beyond transactions. HNB, your partner in progress.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Kasturi Chellaraja. Now for a closer look at the latest on the economy. Joining me is economist and LMD columnist Shiran Fernando. Welcome back to the show, Shiran. Now, with the COVID virus spreading across the globe, tourism has taken a hit. The healthcare sector is under immense stress. There have been bans placed on products being sourced from China, and global stock markets are also in a downturn. What does this spell for our economy?
So unfortunately, I think COVID-19 has evolved and now has a prolonged kind of an impact from its start in December. And things, just as you thought, COVID was sort of maybe easing out and the problem was contained within China. I think just 2 Mondays ago, it reemerged out with cases reported in outside China, which is Iran to South Korea to Italy. So that sort of spooked markets, as you rightly said, and I think the week 2 weeks prior to this, I think you saw on a weekly basis about 5 trillion lost in the global stock markets. The S&P and the Dow Jones sort of seeing its worst weekly fall since the global financial crisis in 2008. So there is an overall concern, and I think markets are now really pricing in the risk that COVID could potentially have. And just on Tuesday, we saw the US Federal Reserve also now reversing from earlier increasing interest rates to actually easing interest rates. So global central banks, global policymakers, G7 also now thinking, okay, what can we do collectively, which is something you actually saw post the financial crisis and in 2011 when you saw sort of the Greek, Italian, kind of the European debt crisis as well. So interesting, we're going back to that kind of a period. So what this is having impact in terms of what's going on in Sri Lanka, I think, is very much on, in particular on our export side. If you look at from apparels to tea, if you look at apparels, for example, a lot of the imports, the yarn, things like that, are sourced from China. Usually and yearly, what happens is because of the New Year, the Chinese New Year in February, apparel companies do stock up because factories naturally shut down and only reopen towards the end of February. Now that most haven't really reopened, the question is how much longer can inventory be held, and you're able to cater towards our export demand. So that's one side of the concern. The other side is like industries like tea and others which depend on, say, packaging imports to get that finished good out there. That's also a bit of a concern at the moment. So on the export side, whether we'll see really impact, and I think the January figures released by the Export Development Board also show that exports sort of contracted under 10% in January compared to the previous year. So the signs are not that great in terms of on the export side. What on the import side, what it could mean is China in 2019 was Sri Lanka's largest importer. Usually it's between China and India, and maybe we'll see maybe we'll see China, the imports from China maybe curtailing, and maybe that import pressure will be less. And another phenomenon we've seen is oil prices really sharply falling. So it was around $66 a barrel, that's the Brent price, and now it went to a low at least close to about $50 a barrel. So from an import side, maybe it might have a positive impact, but definitely net it will be negative for Sri Lanka going forward.
What is being done to counter or to prepare ourselves for this inevitable global downturn that will come up?
So from insulating ourselves compared to, say, 10 years ago when you had the global financial crisis, Sri Lanka is much more exposed to international capital markets, much more exposed to the export trade and the overall world trade. So there's very little we can do in that exposure because has been part of our development. I think Sri Lanka could position itself, given how robust our public health system has been towards countering a lot of the issues, position itself as a very strong kind of a country in terms of not really seeing too many cases, being able to deal with the existing cases. And when things do get better, the big part here is whether they'll now go into a pandemic, a full-blown pandemic, or will it sort of ease out as we go on. And if Sri Lanka is able to weather the current storm and tourism sort of even rebounds, we can see similar to post-April attacks. By December, Sri Lanka was almost back to normal.
What are the pros and cons, Shiran, of this moratorium on debt that the government is thinking about?
So that's sort of from a more cash flow point of view, because during the year, for example, we have about 6 billion in terms of repayments, both the principal payments and also interest payments. So I think refinancing some of the debt we may have got from China or from India is sort of in that process. But it's very difficult to see whether it will be really sawn through. So, for example, with India, it's more of a swap that usually gets taken place. With China, I mean, you can look to renegotiate some of the, say, Exim Bank loans, but you never know what the costs and things that would entail. But I think there should be a more holistic strategy to see, okay, what is our short-term debt strategy, what is our medium-term strategy, and then look to not get into projects which will add more debt, which at the end then makes the cash flow situation worse. But this is a very short-term measure, which I don't think should sort of be looked at as the only strategy to help our debt situation.
Thank you for joining us, Shiran.
Thank you.
That was economist and LMD columnist Shiran Fernando. Thank you for watching Benchmark, and we hope to see you again next time.